Some moments change everything. When a child stands alone in the rain with nowhere to go, it takes just one person to step forward and change two lives forever. In a small town, 60-year-old cattleman Silas Granger watches a heartbreaking scene. 10-year-old Clara, clutching only a doll and wet sack, is cast out by her stepfather right after her mother's funeral. Her mother once showed Silas kindness when he had nothing. Now Clara has nothing. While everyone watches silently, Silas makes a choice that surprises the town. He kneels beside the grieving girl, but can two broken souls truly become family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from tonight. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Because tomorrow, I've saved something truly extra special just for you that you absolutely won't want to miss at all. The morning sun stretched across Silas Granger's ranch like a familiar friend, painting the weathered fence posts and rolling pasture land in shades of gold and amber. At 60, Silas moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned to waste neither motion nor words. His hands, scarred and calloused from decades of ranch work, wrapped around his coffee cup with the same careful attention he gave everything else in his ordered world. The Granger Ranch sat on 800 acres of prime Montana grazing land, inherited from his father and grandfather before him. 3 generations of Granger men had worked this soil, raised cattle on these hills, and built their lives around the rhythms of seasons and storms. Silas had done the same until 5 years ago when Sarah died and left him rattling around the big house like a loose horseshoe in an empty barn. Sarah, even now, her absence filled the kitchen more completely than her presence ever had. She would have been up an hour before him, humming quietly while she prepared breakfast, her small hands already busy with the day's first tasks. The silence that greeted him each morning felt heavier than the work that lay ahead, heavier than the loneliness that had become his closest companion. He dressed in the same ritual he had followed for 40 years. Clean jeans, worn but pressed, a cotton shirt that had seen better decades but still held its shape, boots that molded to his feet like old friends. The mirror in the bedroom reflected a man who carried his years well, silver threading through dark hair, lines mapping a face that had seen joy and sorrow in equal measure, gray eyes that missed little but revealed less. The town of Cedar Ridge lay 15 miles down a dusty road that wound through valleys and over gentle hills. Population 847, according to the sign that needed repainting, though Silas suspected the number was optimistic. Like many rural communities in 1954, Cedar Ridge was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where handshakes still meant something, and where the color of a person's skin could determine which door they entered and where they sat in church. Silas had always been a man who minded his own affairs. He paid his bills, treated his neighbors fairly, and expected the same in return. He employed 3 ranch hands, good men who worked hard and earned their wages, and he voted in every election, though he kept his political opinions to himself. In a town where taking sides was as natural as breathing, Silas Granger was known as a man who chose his battles carefully, which made his relationship with Melody Washington all the more remarkable. Melody was a seamstress, one of only 2 black families in Cedar Ridge. She lived in a small house near the railroad tracks with her daughter Clara and her second husband Vernon Hastings. Vernon worked at the grain elevator when work was available, which wasn't often enough to keep food on the table consistently. Melody's needle and thread filled the gaps that Vernon's pride and irregular employment left wide open. Silas first met Melody 3 years ago during one of his lean periods. A late spring blizzard had killed 30 head of his best cattle, and the bank was making noises about extending his loan. He had a meeting with the loan officer in town and only one decent shirt to his name, the one with a torn sleeve and a button hanging by a thread. Sarah had always handled such repairs, but Sarah was gone, and Silas faced the choice of looking like a man who couldn't manage his own affairs or swallowing his pride. He chose pride swallowing. Melody's shop occupied the back room of the Morrison's store, accessible through an alley entrance that most of the town's white residents used when they needed her services but preferred not to be seen seeking them. Silas had walked through the front door instead, his hat in his hands and his shirt carefully folded. "Mrs. Washington," he had said, because Sarah had raised him to show proper respect. "I wonder if you might have time to tend to this shirt. I can pay fair wages." Melody looked up from her sewing machine, her dark eyes taking in his weathered face and honest manner. She was a woman in her 30s then, with gentle features and hands that moved like birds over fabric. Clara, maybe 7 years old at the time, peeked around her mother's skirt, all wide eyes and curiosity. "Mr. Granger," Melody had replied, her voice carrying the musical quality that some voices possess naturally. "I'd be happy to help. This shouldn't take but a few minutes." She worked with swift, sure movements while Silas waited, her fingers guiding thread through fabric with the precision of someone who understood that a living could be found in the smallest details done well. Clara watched from her corner, playing quietly with a cloth doll that had seen better years, but was clearly treasured. When Melody finished, the repair was invisible. The sleeve looked better than it had when Sarah first bought the shirt. Silas reached for his wallet, but Melody shook her head. "No charge today, Mr. Granger. I heard about your cattle. Sometimes we all need a neighbor's help." The kindness was unexpected and complete. In a town where racial lines were drawn as clearly as property boundaries, Melody Washington had offered grace to a man she barely knew, expecting nothing in return. Silas left the shop with his shirt and something else he couldn't quite name, a debt that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with human decency. He returned 2 weeks later with payment for the first, repair and another shirt that needed attention, then a torn jacket. Sarah's mending basket, neglected since her death, became regular visits to Melody's small shop. They talked while she worked, careful conversations about weather and crops and small-town happenings. Silas learned that Clara was smart as a whip, reading books beyond her years. Melody learned that Silas missed his wife in ways that went deeper than loneliness. Vernon Hastings tolerated these visits with poorly concealed suspicion. He was a man who had learned to view white attention as dangerous, even when it appeared friendly. Silas understood this wariness and kept his visits brief and his manner formal. But Clara seemed to look forward to seeing him, always peeking around corners and offering shy smiles when he arrived. The last time Silas saw Melody alive, she had pressed her silver thimble into Clara's small hand while teaching her to sew. "Steady hands make straight stitches, baby girl," she had said, her voice carrying the weight of lessons that went far beyond needlework. "And straight stitches hold when the world tries to tear things apart." That thimble, worn smooth by countless hours of careful work, represented more than a tool of trade. It was a bridge between generations, between mother and daughter, between the life Melody had built and the uncertain future she sensed approaching. Clara had worn it on her finger like a talisman, too large for her small hands, but perfect for her large heart. Now Melody was gone, claimed by pneumonia that turned deadly too fast for the town's single doctor to save her. The funeral was scheduled for this grey March morning, and Silas knew he would attend. Not because convention demanded it, indeed convention suggested otherwise, but because Melody Washington had shown him kindness when he needed it most, and some debts could only be paid with presence and respect. As he finished his coffee and prepared to hitch the wagon for the ride to town, Silas thought about the silver thimble and the little girl who wore it. He thought about Vernon Hastings, whose grief was already curdling into resentment and blame. He thought about a community that would gather to say goodbye to a woman who had served them faithfully, while never being fully accepted into their circle. Most of all, he thought about Clara, 10 years old, and about to discover how quickly the world could change, how quickly kindness could disappear, how quickly a child could find herself standing alone in the rain with nowhere to go. If Silas Granger had been a superstitious man, he might have recognized the morning's strange stillness as an omen. But he was a practical man who believed in work and weather and the dependable rhythm of seasons. He could not have imagined that before the day ended, his own life would be torn apart and rebuilt, that his careful solitude would be shattered by a choice that would define the rest of his years. The thimble was waiting, along with the little girl who wore it. And sometimes, the most important decisions are the ones we never see coming. The rain began as Reverend Morrison spoke the final words over Melody Washington's grave. What had started as a light mist during the service now fell in steady drops that turned the cemetery dirt to mud and bent the heads of the mourners gathered around the simple wooden casket. Clara stood between Vernon Hastings and her grandmother, a frail woman who had made the journey from 3 counties over to see her daughter laid to rest. The child wore a black dress that had been hastily altered to fit her small frame, the hem still showing pins where Melody's skilled hands would never finish the work. In her arms, she clutched the cloth doll that had been her constant companion since she was barely walking. A simple thing made from scraps of fabric, with button eyes and a smile embroidered in careful stitches by her mother's loving hands. Silas stood apart from the main group of mourners, his hat in his hands and rain darkening his shoulders. He had positioned himself near the back, close enough to pay his respects, but distant enough not to draw attention. Cedar Ridge's social conventions were as rigid as winter ground, and a white rancher attending a black woman's funeral was unusual enough, without making it more complicated by standing too close to family. The mourners were few. Melody had been well regarded for her skill with needle and thread, but friendship and professional respect were different things in a town like Cedar Ridge. Most of the white families she had sewn for were represented by their wives, who stood with appropriate solemnity while keeping careful distance from the immediate family. The black families in town had come in full force, all dozen members of the small community that had formed around the railroad work and the grain elevator. Reverend Morrison's words carried across the cemetery with practiced cadence. "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away," he intoned, his voice competing with the rain that drummed against umbrellas and ran in small rivers between the headstones. "Blessed be the name of the Lord." Clara's grandmother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that had seen better days, her shoulders shaking with grief that went beyond this single loss. Burying a child was against the natural order, a burden that aged women carried like stones in their hearts. At 73, she had already buried a husband, 2 sons, and now her youngest daughter. The weight of such sorrow showed in every line of her weathered face. Vernon Hastings stood rigid beside the grave, his face a mask that revealed nothing and everything. Silas had seen that expression before, in men who had learned that showing pain only invited more of it. Vernon's grief was private and sharp, complicated by circumstances that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. He had married Melody 2 years ago, a practical arrangement that provided her with protection and him with respectability. But Clara had never been part of that equation. As the service concluded, mourners began to drift away in small groups, their conversations muted and brief. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the dirt pathways muddy and forcing people to step carefully between the graves. Clara remained beside the mound of earth that covered her mother, seemingly oblivious to the rain that plastered her dress to her thin frame. Her grandmother approached Vernon with steps that spoke of age and arthritis. "I'll be heading back tomorrow," she said quietly. "Train leaves at 10. Vernon nodded without looking at her. "Safe travels. What about the child?" The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a dying fire. Vernon's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of a decision already made. "Clara's not my blood," he said simply. "I married Melody, not her whole history. I got work waiting in Kansas City. Man at the grain elevator knows someone who's hiring." The grandmother's face creased with understanding and despair. "I can't take her, Vernon. My sister and I share 2 rooms and barely manage on her pension. There's no space for a growing child. Then the county will have to figure something out." Vernon's voice held no malice, but no warmth either. It was the voice of a man making practical decisions in a world that offered few good choices. I never signed papers making her mine legal-like. Far as I know, that makes her nobody's responsibility but the state's. Clara looked up at the sound of her name. Water running down her face in streams that mixed rain with tears. She might not even know she was crying. The cloth doll in her arms was soaked through, its faded fabric darkening with moisture. But she held it close, as if it could anchor her to something solid in a world that was washing away. What about her things? The grandmother asked. Vernon gestured toward a burlap sack that sat beside the grave, its contents protected by nothing more than hope and tightly tied rope. Everything that was hers. The rest stays with the house. The cruelty of it struck Silas like a physical blow. This was not malice for its own sake, but something worse, the casual dismissal of a child's life as an inconvenience to be resolved quickly and without sentiment. Clara's entire existence reduced to whatever could fit in a feed sack, her future decided by men who saw her as a problem rather than a person. The other mourners were walking away now, their own lives calling them back to warmth and routine. No one stopped to object. No one suggested alternatives. The unspoken understanding was clear. This was not their business, not their responsibility, not their place to intervene. In a town where stepping across social boundaries required careful consideration, stepping across racial ones was unthinkable. Clara's grandmother pressed something into the child's free hand, a few dollars. Bills that represented more generosity than she could afford, and whispered words that the rain swallowed before Silas could hear them. Then she was walking away too, her steps uncertain on the muddy ground, leaving Clara standing alone beside her mother's grave. Vernon turned to go, then paused and looked back at the child who had been part of his household for 2 years, but never part of his heart. "County office opens Monday," he said, his words directed more to the air than to Clara. "Someone there will know what to do with you." That was when Silas moved. Later, he would not remember making the conscious decision. He would not recall the moment when watching became action, when conscience overruled caution. He only remembered the sound his boots made in the mud, and the way Clara looked up when his shadow fell across her. She was so small. Standing there in the rain with her soaked dress and her doll and her burlap sack, she looked like something the storm had torn loose and forgotten to carry away. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, held the particular emptiness that comes to children who have learned not to expect rescue. Silas knelt in the mud beside her, ignoring the cold water that seeped through his trouser knees. Up close, he could see that Melody's silver thimble still adorned Clara's small finger, too large and too precious to lose, but impossible to put away. Her mother's final gift, worn like a promise that some things endure, even when everything else disappears. "Clara," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that Vernon, still walking away, might not hear. "Your mama was a good woman. She was kind to me when I needed kindness." Clara nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the mound of dirt that had swallowed her world. "You ride with me now," Silas said, the words surprising him with their certainty. "If you want to." It was not a question exactly, and not quite a command. It was an offer made from one lonely soul to another, extended without conditions or expectations. Clara looked at him for a long moment, this man who had been her mother's customer and something approaching friend. Then she nodded once, a small movement that changed everything. Vernon had stopped walking and turned back, his face darkening with anger or relief. It was impossible to tell which. "You sure about this, Granger? She's not your problem. She's not a problem at all," Silas replied, rising from his crouch with Clara's wet hand in his. "She's a little girl who needs a place to belong." The other mourners had stopped their retreat and were watching now, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, the careful social order of Cedar Ridge had been disrupted by an act of simple human decency. Clara picked up her burlap sack with her free hand, the cloth doll tucked securely in the crook of her arm. Together, she and Silas walked away from the grave, away from Vernon's anger and the town's stunned silence, toward a wagon that waited at the cemetery gate. Neither of them looked back. There would be time enough later to count the cost of this moment, to measure what had been lost and what might be gained. For now, there was only the rain and the road ahead, and the quiet knowledge that some decisions define a life, in ways that can never be undone. The ride to the ranch passed in, silence broken only by the steady rhythm of horse hooves on wet earth, and the occasional creak of wagon wheels finding ruts in the muddy road. Clara sat beside Silas on the wagon seat, her burlap sack clutched in her lap, and her cloth doll pressed against her chest like armor against the unknown. The rain had stopped, but water still dripped from her hair and dress, and Silas could feel the small tremors that ran through her thin frame. He had made this drive countless times over the years, usually alone with his thoughts and the familiar landscape rolling past. Today, the 15 miles stretched longer than usual, weighted with uncertainty and the awareness of a child's quiet breathing beside him. Every mile marker seemed to ask the same question: what exactly had he gotten himself into? The Granger ranch house came into view as the wagon crested the final hill, its weathered cedar siding and tin roof looking solid and welcoming against the gray afternoon sky. Smoke rose from the chimney where Silas had banked the morning fire, and the porch light glowed yellow in the gathering dusk. It was a good house, built to last through Montana winters and summer storms, but it had been designed for adults who understood its rhythms and requirements. Clara's first glimpse of her new home came without comment. She took in the corrals and outbuildings, the grazing cattle in distant pastures, the vegetable garden that Sarah had planted and Silas had maintained with declining enthusiasm. Her expression remained carefully neutral, the look of a child who had learned not to invest too much hope in any single place or moment. "Well," Silas said as he helped her down from the wagon, his hands awkward around her small waist, "I suppose we should get you dried off and warmed up." The house felt different with Clara in it. Her presence seemed to highlight every bachelor habit Silas had developed since Sarah's death, every corner where dust had accumulated, and every meal he had eaten standing at the kitchen counter rather than sitting at the table like a civilized person. The living room, with its worn furniture and stack of unread newspapers, looked shabby through a child's eyes. Clara stood in the entryway, dripping onto Sarah's braided rug, her arms wrapped around her doll, and her eyes taking careful inventory of this strange new world. The house was larger than any she had lived in, but it felt hollow somehow, like a shell that had forgotten what it once contained. "Let's get you some dry clothes," Silas said, then realized the magnitude of that simple statement. He had no idea what size clothing a 10-year-old girl might wear, no understanding of what was appropriate or necessary. His own wardrobe consisted of work clothes and church clothes, with nothing in between that could possibly fit a child. They climbed the stairs to the second floor, Clara's wet shoes leaving small prints on the hardwood. Silas opened the door to what had once been the guest room, a space that Sarah had kept ready for visitors who rarely came. The bed was made with precision military corners, the dresser top bare, except for a thin layer of dust and a ceramic water pitcher that hadn't been used in years. "This can be your room," he said, then wondered if he should have asked her preference first. Did children have opinions about such things? He honestly didn't know. Clara set down her burlap sack and looked around the room with the same careful assessment she had given everything else. It was clean and functional, with a window that looked out over the pastures and morning sun. The bed was too large for her small frame, but it had a thick quilt that Sarah had made during the first year of their marriage, when her hands were still steady and her eyes still sharp. "It's nice," Clara said quietly, her first words since leaving the cemetery. Her voice carried the careful politeness of a child who understood the importance of not causing trouble. Silas nodded, then realized that politeness was not the same as comfort. "We'll need to get you some proper clothes tomorrow. For now, maybe we can find something that will do." He rummaged through his dresser and found an old flannel shirt that had shrunk in the wash, still too large for Clara but better than her wet dress. She accepted it with thanks and looked around uncertainly until Silas understood that she needed privacy to change. He retreated to the hallway, closing the door behind him and wondering how many such small protocols he would need to learn. When Clara emerged, she looked even smaller in his oversized shirt, the sleeves rolled up multiple times and the hem reaching nearly to her knees. But she was dry, and some color had returned to her cheeks. She had brushed her hair with her fingers and retied it with a piece of string from her burlap sack. "Are you hungry?" Silas asked, then realized he had no idea what children ate for supper. His own meals had become increasingly simple since Sarah died. Beans and cornbread, leftover stew, whatever required minimal preparation and cleanup. Clara nodded. Then they went downstairs to the kitchen, where Silas began taking inventory of possibilities. Flour, yes. Eggs from the chickens. Salt pork that might do for flavoring. As he considered options, Clara approached the kitchen table where her burlap sack sat waiting. She opened it carefully and began removing its contents. A change of clothes, a small brush, a few books that had survived the dampness, and finally a small leather-bound journal that she handled with particular care. The journal fell open in her hands, revealing pages covered with Melody's precise handwriting. "Mama's recipes," Clara said softly, running her finger down a page covered with instructions for cornbread, biscuits, and chicken stew. "She wrote down everything she knew how to make, in case I ever needed to know." The simplicity of it struck Silas with unexpected force. Here was a mother's love, reduced to measurements and cooking times, a final gift that acknowledged both hope and fear for her daughter's future. Melody had known, perhaps better than she let on, that her health was failing. This journal was her way of ensuring that Clara would not go hungry for lack of knowledge. "Could you teach me to make her cornbread?" Silas asked, surprising himself with the question. "I never was much of a cook, and I imagine yours was better than anything I manage." Clara looked up at him with something approaching interest, the first spark of engagement he had seen since the cemetery. "She used bacon grease and a little honey," she said, turning pages until she found the right recipe. Said it made the difference between eating and enjoying. They worked together in the kitchen as the sun set outside the windows, Clara reading her mother's instructions while Silas measured ingredients and heated the cast-iron skillet. The process was halting and imperfect. Neither of them was sure about timing, and the first batch came out slightly burned on one side, but it filled the house with warmth and the smell of something approaching home as they sat at the kitchen table sharing the cornbread and some leftover stew. Clara spoke again. "How long can I stay?" The question hung between them like smoke, honest and necessary and impossible to answer with certainty. Silas looked at this child who had trusted him enough to climb into his wagon, who had shared her mother's recipes and worn his shirt like it was normal for a black girl to sit at a white man's kitchen table in 1954 Montana. "As long as you want to," he said finally, meaning it completely and hoping it would prove possible. Clara nodded and took another bite of cornbread, chewing thoughtfully. Outside, the first of his ranch hands was riding in from the day's work, and tomorrow would bring questions that neither of them was prepared to answer. But for now, there was only the warm kitchen and the taste of honey cornbread, and the quiet understanding that some promises are made not with words, but with presence. The cloth doll sat propped against Clara's water glass, its button eyes reflecting the lamplight, as if keeping watch over this strange new beginning. By the end of Clara's first week at the ranch, the news had spread through Cedar Ridge like spilled water, finding every crack and crevice. At Morrison's general store, conversations stopped when Silas entered to buy supplies. At the post office, Mrs. Henderson made a point of asking after his houseguest with the particular tone reserved for situations that polite society found noteworthy but difficult to discuss directly. The talk was not necessarily malicious, but it was constant. Cedar Ridge was a small town where unusual events became community property, examined and discussed until every angle had been explored and every opinion voiced. A 60-year-old widower taking in a 10-year-old black girl was unusual enough to fuel speculation that would last months. Clara seemed unaware of the attention, or perhaps she had learned early to ignore the weight of other people's opinions. She had thrown herself into ranch life with the determination of someone who understood that usefulness was often the price of belonging. Each morning she was up before dawn, dressed in clothes that Silas had hastily purchased from the dry goods section of Morrison's store, practical items that fit well enough but lacked the careful attention that Melody would have provided. She had appointed herself assistant to whatever task Silas was undertaking, whether it was feeding chickens, mending fence, or checking on the cattle in the near pastures. Her small hands were quick and sure, shaped by hours spent helping her mother with delicate sewing work, and she approached each new skill with the focused attention of someone who knew that competence was a form of security. "Hold the wire steady while I twist it," Silas instructed as they repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by winter storms. Clara gripped the metal with both hands, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. "That's it. Keep tension on it so it won't slip." The fence repair was simple work, but it required two people, and Clara had proven herself a capable partner despite her size. She listened to instructions without needing them repeated, and remembered techniques from one day to the next. More importantly, she seemed to find genuine satisfaction in the work itself, in the knowledge that her efforts contributed to something larger and more permanent than herself. "Why do you fix everything yourself?" she asked as they moved to the next damaged section. "In town, most folks hire help for big jobs." Silas considered the question while he sorted through his toolbox. "I suppose I learned early that if you want something done right, you'd better know how to do it yourself. My father believed a man should be able to handle whatever his land required. What if you don't know how? Then you figure it out. Or you find someone who does and pay attention while they teach you." Clara nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Which perhaps it did to a child who had watched her mother master dozens of skills out of necessity rather than choice. They worked in comfortable silence after that, the kind that develops between people who understand each other's rhythms and requirements. But the nights were harder. 3 times during that first week, Silas had been awakened by Clara's cries from the guest room, anguished sounds that spoke of dreams where loss was fresh and abandonment was immediate. Each time, he had padded down the hallway in his nightshirt, unsure of protocol, but unable to ignore the distress. The first night, he had simply stood outside her door, listening to sobs that seemed too large for her small body to contain. The second night, he had knocked softly and asked if she was all right, receiving only a muffled assurance that she was fine. The third night, he had entered without invitation and found her sitting up in bed, clutching her cloth doll and shaking with the aftermath of whatever terror had visited her dreams. "She was trying to tell me something," Clara had whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Mama was trying to tell me something important, but I couldn't hear her. Every time I tried to get closer, she got farther away." Silas had sat on the edge of the bed, his own memories stirring in response to her grief. He knew about dreams that brought back the dead only to lose them again, about the cruel hope that sleep could undo what daylight made permanent. "I used to have dreams about my mother, too," he said quietly. "She died when I was not much older than you. Scarlet fever took her and my baby sister the same winter." Clara looked at him with surprise, perhaps not having considered that adults carried their own burden of early losses. "Did the dreams stop?" "Eventually. But I learned they weren't really about seeing her again. They were about saying goodbye properly. Sometimes that takes longer than we think it should." He had stayed with her until she fell asleep again, then returned to his own bed, where Sarah's wedding ring lay in the top drawer of his nightstand, wrapped in the handkerchief she had embroidered during their courtship. He touched the ring sometimes when sleep wouldn't come, remembering the weight of it on her finger and the promises they had made to each other in the small church where Melody was now buried. Sarah would have known what to do with Clara's nightmares. She would have known the right words to offer comfort without false promises, the right balance between sympathy and strength. Sarah had possessed an intuitive understanding of when to hold close and when to step back, when to speak and when to listen. These were skills that Silas was learning through trial and error, with Clara as his patient teacher in the art of caring for someone smaller and more fragile than himself. The crisis came on Saturday afternoon when Reverend Morrison arrived unannounced, his black car raising dust as it wound up the ranch road. Clara was in the barn, mucking stalls, with the determination of someone who had discovered that physical work could temporarily quiet mental turmoil. Silas met the Reverend on the front porch, offering coffee that was politely declined. "Silas," Morrison began without preamble, "I'm here out of concern for both you and the child. People are talking, and some of what they're saying isn't kind. People always talk, Reverend. Doesn't make their opinions my business." Morrison removed his hat and turned it in his hands, a gesture that revealed his discomfort with the conversation. "The county has people whose job it is to look after orphaned children. There are proper procedures, legal channels. What you've done comes from a good heart, but it might not be in anyone's best interest long term." "Might not be," Silas agreed. "But it might be exactly what's needed. Clara's not hurting anyone, and she's not being hurt. Sometimes that's enough to start with, but is it enough to build on? You're a single man with no experience raising children, especially a girl child. And there are other considerations, social considerations, that can't be ignored. The social considerations hung between them, unspoken but clear. In 1954, Montana, a white man raising a black child was not simply unusual. It challenged assumptions about how society should organize itself, about who belonged where and with whom. Before Silas could respond, Clara appeared in the barn doorway, alerted by the sound of voices. She had removed her work gloves and smoothed her hair, instinctively understanding that company required better presentation. When she saw the Reverend, she offered a polite curtsy that Melody had taught her for occasions when manners mattered most. "Good afternoon, Reverend Morrison," she said clearly. "Would you like some lemonade? Mr. Granger taught me to make it yesterday." Morrison looked at her with surprise, perhaps expecting to find a sullen or frightened child, rather than this poised young girl who spoke with careful dignity. "That's very kind of you, Clara. How are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you. Mr. Granger has been teaching me about ranch work. I'm learning to milk the cows and collect eggs. Yesterday I helped him deliver a calf that was coming backwards." She spoke with pride about accomplishments that a week ago she had never imagined attempting. More than that, she spoke with the confidence of someone who had found her place and intended to defend it. Morrison turned to Silas with something approaching approval. "She seems to be thriving. She's a good worker and quick to learn. Her mother raised her right, and you're prepared for the long-term implications. The questions that will come as she gets older." Silas looked at Clara, who was listening to this conversation about her future with the careful attention of someone who understood that adults often made decisions about children without consulting them. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she smiled, not the polite expression she had worn for the Reverend, but a real smile that transformed her serious face into something approaching joy. "I'm prepared to figure it out as we go," Silas said. Same as any parent, the word hung in the air between them. Unprecedented and permanent. Parent, not guardian, not temporary caretaker, but something that implied choice and commitment and love that had nothing to do with blood or convention or what other people might think. Clara's smile widened, and in that moment, Silas understood that he had crossed a line from which there would be no returning. Somewhere in the past week, between nightmares and fence repairs and lessons in making lemonade, they had become something that no legal document could define, but that both of them recognized as real. Morrison left soon after, his concerns not entirely satisfied, but his immediate worries somewhat eased by what he had witnessed. As his car disappeared down the road, Clara turned to Silas with a question that revealed she had been listening more carefully than either adult had realized. What did he mean about long-term implications? Silas considered his answer carefully. understanding that Clara deserved honesty even when the truth was complicated. He meant that some people won't understand why we've chosen to be a family. They'll have opinions about whether it's right or proper. And what do you think? Silas looked at this child who had swept his kitchen that morning before he was awake, who had listened patiently while he taught her to read cattle brands, who had trusted him enough to share her mother's recipes and her nighttime fears. "I think," he said slowly, "that family is what you make it, not what other people expect it to look like." Clara nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she ran toward the barn, calling over her shoulder that the evening chores wouldn't do themselves. Her laughter carried on the wind, the first time Silas had heard that particular music since the day he had knelt beside her in the rain. In the house that evening, as Clara read aloud from one of her books, while Silas mended harness, he thought about Sarah's wedding ring in his nightstand drawer. Perhaps it was time to put it away in a different place, somewhere that honored the past without holding too tightly to it. Some promises were meant to be kept by opening the heart wider, not by closing it against new possibilities. The letter from the Cedar Ridge School Board arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Tommy Morrison, the Reverend's youngest son, who accepted Silas's tip with the wide-eyed curiosity of a boy who had been instructed not to ask questions, but clearly wanted to. The envelope bore the official seal of the district office and the careful penmanship of Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, who had served as secretary to 3 different superintendents and considered herself the guardian of educational propriety. Silas read the letter twice while Clara finished her breakfast, the formal language doing little to disguise the complexity of the situation it described. The school board acknowledged Clara's right to an education under state law, but noted that special circumstances required careful consideration of placement options. A meeting was requested at the earliest convenience to discuss appropriate arrangements for her continued schooling. Clara looked up from her oatmeal, her dark eyes taking in Silas's expression with the perceptiveness that seemed to come naturally to children who had learned early to read adult moods for signs of impending change. "Is that about me?" "It's from the school board," Silas said, folding the letter and setting it beside his coffee cup. "They want to meet about getting you enrolled properly. I've been reading to you every evening," Clara said quietly. "You know I can read as well as any child my age." Better than some. This was undeniably true. During their evening sessions by the fireplace, Clara had worked her way through several of the books that Melody had saved for her education. She read with fluency and comprehension that impressed Silas, often pausing to explain references or ask questions that revealed a mind hungry for knowledge and capable of making connections across different subjects. "The reading isn't the issue," Silas said carefully. "The issue is that some folks in town aren't sure how to handle having you in the same classroom as their children." Clara's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted slightly, the way a person might brace for a blow they could see coming. "Because I'm different from them. Because some people think differences matter more than they actually do." The meeting took place that Thursday afternoon, in the small conference room behind the superintendent's office, with 5 school board members arranged around a scarred wooden table that had seen decades of difficult conversations. Silas arrived in his best suit, the one he wore to church and funerals, with Clara beside him, in a dress that Mrs. Morrison had quietly delivered the day before, a cast-off from her own daughter, but clean and well-fitted and appropriate for the occasion. Superintendent Jenkins, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, opened the meeting with careful formality. "Mr. Granger, we appreciate you coming in today. As you know, we need to discuss Clara's educational placement. I assumed she would attend the same school as every other child her age in this district," Silas replied evenly. "Under normal circumstances, yes. But we have to consider the welfare of all our students, as well as the wishes of their parents. Some concerns have been raised about potential disruptions to the learning environment." Mrs. Hutchins consulted her notes with the air of someone who had anticipated this conversation. The state integrated the schools 2 years ago, Mr. Granger, but that doesn't mean the transition has been without challenges. We currently have 12 Negro children enrolled across all grades, and they attend classes in the East Wing under special supervision. Special supervision, Silas repeated. What exactly does that mean? They have their own teacher, their own classroom space. It allows them to receive appropriate instruction while minimizing potential conflicts with other families who might have different expectations. Clara had been listening to this discussion of her future with the composed attention of someone much older than her 10 years. Now she spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice clear and steady despite the circumstances. "What grade would I be placed in?" she asked. Jenkins consulted a folder in front of him. "Based on your age, you would typically be in 5th grade. However, we would need to assess your current academic level to determine appropriate placement. I'd be happy to take any test you think necessary," Clara replied with a confidence that surprised the adults around the table. "I've been reading at what I believe is a 7th grade level, and my arithmetic is strong through basic algebra." The board members exchanged glances that revealed their surprise. They had perhaps expected to find a child in need of remedial attention, not one who spoke with such self-assurance about her abilities. "Very well," Jenkins said after a pause. "We can arrange for testing next week. In the meantime, we should discuss the practical arrangements for your attendance." The practical arrangements, as they were explained, would require Clara to enter through a side door, eat lunch at a different time than the other students, and receive instruction in the isolated classroom with the district's other black children. These accommodations, Jenkins assured them, were designed to ensure a smooth educational experience for everyone involved. Silas listened to these proposals with growing anger that he kept carefully contained. When the board members finished their presentation, he was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Let me understand this correctly," he said finally. "You're proposing to give Clara an education that's separate but supposedly equal, even though she's demonstrated academic ability that exceeds her grade level. We're proposing to place her where she'll be most comfortable and where her presence won't create unnecessary complications. Seems to me the only complications are the ones you're creating by treating her differently than you would any other capable student." The meeting ended with an agreement to proceed with academic testing, but the underlying tensions remained unresolved. As they walked back to the wagon, Clara's composure finally cracked slightly. "They don't want me there," she said simply. "Some of them don't," Silas agreed. "But that doesn't mean you don't belong there. Sometimes belonging is something you have to claim for yourself." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Clara shared stories her mother had told her about her grandmother's grandmother, a woman who had been born into slavery but lived to see her great-grandchildren attend college. Mama said she used to tell people that dignity was something you carried inside, not something other folks could give you or take away. She said education was like that too, something that belonged to you once you claimed it. Silas whittled while she talked, his hands shaping a piece of cedar wood with movements that had become automatic over the years. Sarah used to tease him about his need to keep his hands busy during conversations, but the rhythmic motion of blade against wood helped him think more clearly. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," he said. "She was. She used to say that every generation had to fight the same battles in new ways, but that the fighting was what proved you deserved to win." By the time full darkness fell, Silas had finished his project, a small wooden horse, carved with the attention to detail that Sarah had always admired in his handiwork. The horse was rearing slightly, its mane flowing as if caught in an invisible wind, its expression alert and spirited. "This is for you," he said, offering the carving to Clara. "Every rancher needs a good horse, even if it's only a wooden one to start with." Clara accepted the gift with reverence that made Silas's throat tight. She turned it over in her small hands, examining each carved detail in the lamplight that spilled from the windows. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "They've never owned anything this fine." You own it now. And someday, if you want, I'll teach you to ride a real one. The wooden horse became Clara's constant companion over the following days, sitting on her nightstand while she slept and riding in her pocket when she accompanied Silas on his rounds. It represented more than craftsmanship. It was a promise of futures that neither of them had imagined possible a month before. When the academic testing results came back the following week, they confirmed what Clara had claimed about her abilities. She tested at a 7th grade reading level and 6th grade mathematics, placing her well above her chronological peers in academic achievement. The school board's response was to suggest that such advanced ability might be difficult to accommodate in their current arrangement. Silas's response was to inform the board that Clara would attend regular classes with students her own age, receiving appropriate academic challenges regardless of anyone's comfort level with the situation. If they couldn't provide that education, he would find someone who could. The battle lines were drawn with polite words and careful courtesy, but the underlying conflict was clear. Clara's future would depend not just on her abilities or her worthiness, but on the community's willingness to see past the color of her skin to the sharpness of her mind and the strength of her character. At Morrison's general store, old Herman Morrison had begun setting aside books that traveling salesmen left behind, passing them quietly to Silas with the suggestion that the young lady might find these interesting. Other townspeople were less supportive, their disapproval expressed through cold silences and conversations that stopped when Clara entered a room. But Clara met both kindness and hostility with equal grace, her mother's lessons in dignity serving her well in circumstances that would have challenged adults with far more experience. She held her head high, spoke politely to everyone regardless of how they treated her, and continued to demonstrate the intelligence and character that made their prejudices look small and petty by comparison. In the evenings, she would read to Silas from whatever book Morrison had provided that week, her clear voice bringing stories to life in the warm circle of lamplight. And each night, she would carefully place her wooden horse on the nightstand beside her bed, where it stood guard over dreams that were beginning to include futures as well as memories. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in November, carried by the same postal worker who had delivered dozens of routine correspondences over the years. But this one felt different the moment Silas saw the return address. Vernon Hastings had written from Kansas City, and the formal tone of the envelope suggested legal matters rather than personal communication. Clara was in the barn, mucking stalls with the methodical efficiency she had developed over the months at the ranch. She had grown taller and stronger during her time there, her shoulders broadening slightly from physical work and her face losing some of the pinched anxiety that had marked her first weeks away from town. The wooden horse Silas had carved for her rode in her shirt pocket, worn smooth from handling but still carefully protected. Silas read Vernon's letter twice, then called Clara in from the barn. She entered the kitchen with straw in her hair and dirt under her fingernails, but she moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in the space she occupied. Over the past months, she had claimed this house as surely as if she had been born in it. "Sit down," Silas said gently, indicating the chair across from him at the kitchen table. "We need to talk about something important." Clara settled into her chair, her dark eyes searching his face for clues about what kind of conversation this would be. She had learned to read his moods and expressions, just as he had learned to interpret her silences and the small ways she showed contentment or concern. "Vernon has written to say he wants you back," Silas said, without preamble. "He's found steady work in Kansas City and claims he's prepared to provide a proper home for you now." The color drained from Clara's face so quickly that Silas reached across the table to steady her. Her hands, which had been folded calmly in her lap, began to tremble. "He doesn't want me," she whispered. "He never wanted me. Why would he want me back now?" Silas had been wondering the same thing. Vernon's letter spoke of responsibility and duty, of having had time to reconsider his hasty decision at the cemetery. But the timing seemed suspicious. coming just as Clara was beginning to establish herself in the community and as stories of her academic abilities were spreading beyond Cedar Ridge. "I don't know his reasons," Silas said honestly. "But I know this. You're not going anywhere you don't want to go." "We'll fight this, Clara, whatever it takes." That afternoon, they drove to town to meet with James Whitfield, the only lawyer in Cedar Ridge and a man who had handled the legal affairs of 3 generations of Granger men. Whitfield's office occupied the 2nd floor above the bank, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked with age and the weight of countless clients seeking justice or refuge from life's complications. Whitfield was a methodical man in his 50s, with grey hair and the careful manner of someone who understood that legal matters were rarely as simple as they appeared. He listened to Silas's explanation of the situation while making notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally asking questions that revealed the complexity of their circumstances. "The fundamental issue," Whitfield explained when Silas finished, "is that you have no legal standing as Clara's guardian. Vernon, as her stepfather, has a stronger claim under the law, even though his original abandonment was morally reprehensible." "What about adoption?" Silas asked. "Could I adopt Clara legally?" "Adoption would require Vernon's consent, which he's clearly unwilling to give. There's also the matter of state approval, which brings its own challenges." Whitfield paused, choosing his words carefully. "The courts are not accustomed to approving interracial adoptions, Silas. Even if Vernon agreed, which he won't, the process would be lengthy and uncertain." Clara had been listening to this discussion of her future with the composed attention that had become her characteristic response to adult conversations about her life. Now she spoke up, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "What if I testified about what I wanted? Don't children have any say in where they live?" Whitfield looked at her with surprise, perhaps not having expected such a direct question from a 10-year-old. "The courts do sometimes consider a child's preferences, especially when the child is mature enough to express reasoned opinions. But you're still quite young, and the judge would weigh many factors beyond your personal wishes." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the first snow of the season dust the distant mountains, Clara asked Silas about his own childhood, about the losses he had mentioned during one of her nightmares weeks earlier. The conversation meandered through memories of parents who died too soon and siblings who didn't survive childhood illnesses that modern medicine might have prevented. "I was 12 when my father decided I was old enough to run the ranch myself," Silas said, his voice carrying the weight of responsibilities assumed too early. "Looking back, I probably wasn't ready, but necessity doesn't wait for readiness. You learn by doing, and you hope you don't make mistakes that can't be fixed." "Were you scared?" Clara asked, terrified. "But I had the ranch to anchor me, work that needed doing regardless of how I felt about it. Sometimes having something bigger than yourself to take care of makes you stronger than you thought you could be." Clara nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "That's how I feel about helping here, like I'm part of something that matters." Over the following weeks, as they waited for Vernon's next move, Clara threw herself into ranch improvements with a passion that surprised even Silas. She suggested modifications to the chicken coop that would improve egg production, reorganized the tool shed according to a system that made everything easier to find, and began keeping detailed records of which cattle were due for breeding and when calves were expected. Her organizational skills, inherited from her mother's careful management of a household budget and sewing business, proved invaluable in managing the complexity of ranch operations. She created charts and schedules that helped Silas track expenses and plan for seasonal needs, turning her natural intelligence toward practical applications that benefited them both. "You've got a head for business," Silas observed one evening as Clara showed him her latest innovation, a record-keeping system that would help them identify which breeding pairs produced the healthiest calves. Mama always said that success was mostly about paying attention to details that other people overlooked, Clara replied. She could look at a piece of fabric and see what it could become, not just what it was. I think ranching might be similar. The insight was profound in its simplicity. Clara was learning to see the ranch not just as it existed, but as it could exist with proper planning and attention. Her suggestions for improvements came not from book learning, but from careful observation of how things actually worked, combined with an intuitive understanding of how they might work better. But their peaceful routine was interrupted again in December when a second letter arrived. This one from Clara's grandmother in Ohio. The elderly woman's handwriting was shaky with age, but her words were clear and devastating. Vernon had contacted her, claiming that Clara was being held against her will by a white man who had no legal right to her custody. The grandmother, who had been unable to take Clara herself due to poverty and illness, was now demanding that the child be returned to her stepfather or placed in a county home where she would be with her own people. Clara read the letter with growing distress, her composure finally cracking as she realized that the family she had barely known was now allied against the family she had chosen. "She doesn't know me," Clara said through tears. "She doesn't know how happy I am here, how much I've learned, how good you've been to me. She's making judgments based on what Vernon told her, not on what's actually true." Silas held her while she cried, feeling helpless in the face of legal and social forces that seemed determined to separate them. But as her tears subsided, he felt her spine straighten with a resolve that reminded him of her mother's quiet strength. "They want to take me away because they think I don't belong here," she said. "But I do belong here. This is my home, and you're my family, and I'm not going to let them tear that apart without a fight." The battle lines were becoming clearer, but so was Clara's determination to claim her rightful place in the family they had built together. Whatever Vernon's true motivations, whatever legal challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family, not because the law recognized their bond, but because they had chosen to recognize it themselves. In the evenings that followed, Clara would sit at the kitchen table with her wooden horse beside her schoolbooks, planning strategies and preparing arguments as if she were a lawyer preparing for the case of her life, which in many ways she was. The discovery came by accident, as many life-changing discoveries do. Clara had been helping Silas organize the small storage room where her mother's remaining possessions had been kept since her arrival at the ranch. The burlap sack that had contained her entire world on that rainy funeral day had been supplemented by a few additional items that Vernon had grudgingly allowed her to collect before his departure for Kansas City. Among these belongings was an old sewing box that had belonged to Melody, its compartments filled with threads and needles and the small tools of her trade. Clara handled each item with reverence, remembering how her mother's hands had moved over fabric with such skill and confidence. At the bottom of the box, beneath a tray of buttons and thimbles, her fingers found something unexpected, a manila envelope sealed with wax and hidden beneath a false bottom that had been carefully crafted to conceal its contents. "Mr. Granger," Clara called, her voice tight with excitement and apprehension. "There's something here that Mama hid." Silas came from the kitchen, where he had been reviewing their legal options with growing frustration. James Whitfield's latest letter had been pessimistic about their chances of fighting Vernon's custody claim, especially given the social pressures that would work against them in any court proceeding. Clara held the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that some secrets, once revealed, change everything that comes after. The wax seal bore the impression of a notary stamp from 1923, more than 30 years old, but still intact. "Should we open it?" she asked. Silas nodded, recognizing that whatever Melody had felt important enough to hide was likely something Clara needed to know, regardless of the consequences. Clara broke the seal carefully and withdrew a collection of papers that had been preserved with the attention of someone who understood their significance. The first document was a deed, yellowed with age but still legible, written in the careful script of an earlier era. It conveyed ownership of 320 acres of prime Montana land to one Marcus Washington, Clara's great-grandfather. in exchange for military service in the Indian Wars of the 1870s. The land described in the deed encompassed most of what was now the eastern section of Cedar Ridge, including portions of what had become the most prosperous ranches in the valley. The second document was a letter from a land development company, dated 1924, informing Marcus Washington's heirs that their property had been reclaimed due to unpaid taxes and would be sold at public auction. The amount owed was listed as $127.50, a sum that would have been manageable for most landowners, but devastating for a black family in 1920s Montana, where employment opportunities were limited and access to credit was virtually non-existent. The final document was the most damaging. A letter from the county tax assessor acknowledging that the tax notices had been sent to an incorrect address, and that the Washington family had never received proper notification of the amounts due or the pending foreclosure. By the time they learned of the situation, their land had already been sold to investors who had immediately resold it to white ranchers at substantial profit. Clara read these documents with growing understanding of what they meant, not just for her family's history but for her present circumstances. "Mama's grandfather owned land," she said quietly. "Good land. And someone took it from him illegally." Silas examined the papers with the careful attention of a man who understood property law through decades of dealing with banks and land agents. The documents appeared genuine, and the story they told was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Marcus Washington had served his country with distinction, earned his homestead through blood and sacrifice, and then lost it through a bureaucratic theft that had enriched others while impoverishing his descendants. "There's more," Clara said, reaching for a small leather journal that had been wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of the envelope. "Mama wrote about it." Melody's journal revealed a family history that had been carefully preserved through oral tradition and scattered documentation. Marcus Washington had been born into slavery, but gained his freedom through military service, eventually settling in Montana, where the promise of land ownership seemed achievable for men willing to work hard and ask little from their neighbors. The journal described how Marcus had built a successful farming operation, raising cattle and growing wheat on the fertile bottomland that fed the streams flowing into the valley. He had employed both white and black workers during harvest seasons, paying fair wages and earning respect for his business acumen and fair dealing, but the prosperity had made him a target for men who believed that valuable land should belong to white owners, regardless of who had earned the legal right to possess it. The tax foreclosure had been engineered by a consortium of local businessmen who had bribed county officials to ensure that tax notices were misdirected, creating the legal fiction of non-payment that justified seizing the property. According to this, Silas said, studying a hand-drawn map that showed the boundaries of the original Washington homestead, your great-grandfather's land included the mineral rights to what's now the Morrison Ranch and part of the Henderson property. That's some of the richest grazing land in the county. The implications were staggering. Clara's family hadn't just lost a farm. They had lost an inheritance that would have made them one of the wealthiest families in the region. The land that had been stolen from Marcus Washington was now worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and recent geological surveys had suggested the possibility of valuable mineral deposits beneath the surface. Clara absorbed this information with a mixture of pride and anger that seemed beyond her 10 years. "Is that why Vernon wants me back? Because I might have a claim to this land?" Silas had been wondering the same thing. Vernon's sudden interest in Clara's welfare, coming just months after her mother's death, seemed suspicious in light of these revelations. If Vernon had known about the hidden documents, or if someone had informed him of their potential existence, his motivation for seeking custody became clear. "It's possible," Silas said carefully. "If you're Marcus Washington's only living descendant, you might have legal standing to challenge the original foreclosure, especially if we can prove that the county violated proper procedures." The next morning, they drove to town to meet with James Whitfield. the documents secured in a leather portfolio that had once belonged to Silas's father. Whitfield's reaction to the papers was immediate and electric. He recognized their significance not just for Clara's personal circumstances, but for the legal precedent they might establish. "This is extraordinary," Whitfield said, spreading the documents across his desk with the reverence due to historical artifacts. "If these are authentic, and they appear to be, then we're looking at a case of systematic land fraud that deprived your great-grandfather of his legal inheritance. Can we prove it in court?" Silas asked. "Possibly. The statute of limitations has run out for most civil remedies, but there might be grounds for challenging the original foreclosure based on procedural violations. More importantly, this gives us leverage in the custody dispute. Vernon's motivation for seeking Clara becomes suspect if he knew about these documents. Word of the discovery spread through Cedar Ridge with the speed of wildfire, carried by courthouse clerks and coffee shop conversations until everyone in town knew that the little black girl living at the Granger Ranch might be the rightful heir to some of the most valuable land in the county. The reactions were predictably mixed. Some townspeople expressed outrage at the historical injustice revealed by the documents, while others questioned their authenticity or argued that past wrongs couldn't be corrected by present actions. The families whose ranches now occupied the original Washington homestead were understandably concerned about the potential challenges to their ownership. Most shocking was the revelation that came from an unexpected source. Herman Morrison, the elderly owner of the general store, approached Silas privately with information that cast the entire situation in a new light. "My father was one of the investors who bought that land at the tax sale," Morrison said, his weathered face showing the strain of carrying a family secret for decades. "I found his papers when he died, including records of payments made to county officials to ensure the foreclosure went through as planned." The admission was devastating and courageous. Morrison was implicating his own father in the conspiracy that had robbed Clara's family of their inheritance. But he was also providing evidence that could help her reclaim what had been stolen. "Why are you telling me this?" Silas asked. "Because it was wrong then, and it's still wrong now. That little girl deserves to know the truth about what happened to her family, and she deserves a chance to set things right." That evening, Silas and Clara sat on the ranch porch as the sun set behind the mountains. The hidden deed spread between them like a map to a future they had never imagined possible. Clara held her wooden horse, turning it over in her hands, while she processed the implications of everything they had learned. "It doesn't change how I feel about living here with you," she said finally. "This is still my home and you're still my family. But now I understand why Mama was always so proud when she talked about our people. We weren't just survivors. We were pioneers and landowners and business people who built something important." Silas nodded, understanding that Clara's sense of identity had been fundamentally altered by these revelations. She was not just an orphaned child dependent on his charity. She was the heir to a legacy of achievement and loss that stretched back generations. "What do you want to do about the land?" he asked. Clara was quiet for a long time, watching the last light fade from the western sky. When she spoke, her words carried a maturity that reminded Silas of her mother's quiet strength and her great-grandfather's pioneering spirit. "I want to fight for it," she said. "Not because I need the money or the land, but because it's mine by right, and because letting them keep what they stole would mean they won." The decision would change everything, Silas knew. Fighting for Clara's inheritance would mean challenging some of the most powerful families in the county, disrupting social arrangements that had been in place for 3 decades, and facing the full weight of a legal system that had never been designed to protect the rights of people who looked like Clara. But as he looked at this remarkable child, who had already overcome so much, Silas felt a surge of pride and determination that surprised him with its intensity. Clara Washington was not just his adopted daughter. She was a warrior preparing for the battle of her life, and he would stand beside her regardless of the cost. The hidden deed had revealed more than family history. It had revealed Clara's true inheritance, not just land and mineral rights, but the strength and dignity of generations who had refused to be defeated by injustice. That inheritance, unlike the stolen acres, could never be taken away. The weeks leading up to the custody hearing transformed Cedar Ridge into a town divided against itself, with conversations halting when certain people entered rooms, and long-time neighbors crossing streets to avoid uncomfortable encounters. The revelation of Clara's potential inheritance had forced the community to confront not just historical injustices, but their own complicity in perpetuating them. James Whitfield's law office became the center of a legal storm that drew attention from as far away as Helena, where civil rights lawyers had caught wind of a case that combined custody disputes with land fraud and mineral rights. The story had elements that made it irresistible to journalists and legal scholars. A brave child fighting for her birthright, historical documents revealing systematic theft, and a community forced to reckon with its past. Clara threw herself into the legal preparation with the intensity of someone who understood that everything she had come to value depended on the outcome of this battle. She spent hours with Whitfield, reviewing documents and preparing testimony that would need to convince a judge not just of her wishes, but of her legal standing to challenge decades-old property transfers. The most significant discovery came when Clara remembered her mother mentioning a family Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. Hidden in a trunk that Vernon had overlooked, the Bible contained a detailed family genealogy written in multiple hands over several generations. The careful records proved Clara's direct descent from Marcus Washington and established her standing as his sole surviving heir. The genealogy revealed a family history more remarkable than any of them had imagined. Marcus Washington had not been the only success story. His children and grandchildren had included teachers, ministers, business owners, and craftspeople who had built lives of dignity and purpose despite facing obstacles that would have defeated lesser spirits. "Look at this entry," Clara said, her finger tracing a line written in Melody's careful handwriting. Mama wrote that her father graduated from college in 1899. He was a teacher who started 3 schools for black children in Montana and Wyoming. Silas studied the entry, understanding that Clara was discovering not just her family's achievements, but the magnitude of what had been lost when their land was stolen. The Washington family hadn't just been farmers. They had been community leaders whose influence had been systematically erased, along with their property rights. But as their legal case strengthened, Vernon's desperation became increasingly apparent. He had arrived in Cedar Ridge 2 weeks before the hearing, taking a room at the boarding house and making his presence felt throughout the town. His story had evolved from concern for Clara's welfare to righteous indignation about white interference in black family matters. Vernon had allied himself with Clara's grandmother, who had made the difficult journey from Ohio despite her advanced age and failing health. The elderly woman's presence complicated the emotional dynamics of the case, representing, as she did, Clara's only connection to her mother's extended family. "She wants to see you," Silas told Clara after returning from a tense encounter at the boarding house. "Your grandmother. She's agreed to meet with us before the hearing." The meeting took place in the church parlor, neutral ground that Reverend Morrison had offered in hopes of facilitating some kind of family reconciliation. Clara's grandmother was a tiny woman, bent with age and worn by hardships that had marked every line in her weathered face. But her eyes were sharp and intelligent, recognizing immediately the changes that ranch life had wrought in her great-granddaughter. "You've grown," she said simply, her voice carrying the musical quality that Clara remembered from her mother's speech. "And you look healthy. Happy even." "I am happy, grandmother," Clara replied, using the formal address that Melody had taught her for addressing elders. "Mr. Granger has been very good to me." The conversation that followed was careful and loaded with subtext, each woman taking the measure of the other, while Vernon sat nearby like a thundercloud threatening to break. Clara's grandmother asked about her schooling, her daily routine, her plans for the future. Clara answered honestly but diplomatically, making it clear that she had found not just shelter but genuine family with Silas. "Vernon tells me you've been filling her head with ideas about land and inheritance," the grandmother said to Silas, her tone carrying decades of wariness about white promises. "My family learned long ago not to trust such dreams. They only lead to disappointment. The documents are real," Silas replied quietly. "And so is Clara's claim to what her great-grandfather earned and lost. She has the right to know her family's true history. History is what white folks write in books. Reality is what black folks live every day. This child belongs with her own people, not playing at being something she can never really be." Clara had been listening to this discussion of her identity and future with the composed attention she brought to all adult conversations about her life. Now she spoke with a clarity that surprised the adults in the room. "Grandmother, I understand your concern, but I am with my own people. Mr. Granger has become my family, not because of his skin color, but because of his character. And I'm not playing at being anything. I'm becoming who I choose to be." The dignity with which Clara stated her position seemed to affect her grandmother more than any argument Silas might have made. For the first time since the conversation began, the elderly woman looked uncertain about the righteousness of her cause. Meanwhile, support for Clara and Silas was building in unexpected quarters. Herman Morrison had publicly backed their legal challenge, despite the potential impact on his own family's reputation. Mrs. Henderson at the post office had organized a collection among the town's women to help cover legal expenses. Even some of the ranchers whose properties might be affected by Clara's inheritance. Glame had expressed admiration for her courage in fighting for her. Writes, "The most surprising ally came from an entirely unexpected source, Dr. Eleanor Pritchard, a retired professor of history from the state university who had moved to Cedar Ridge to research the area's settlement patterns. Dr. Pritchard had examined the Washington family documents and confirmed their authenticity. But more than that, she had uncovered additional evidence of the systematic discrimination that had targeted black landowners throughout Montana in the 1920s. Clara's case is not isolated. Dr. Pritchard explained during a meeting in Whitfield's office. "I've documented at least 15 similar instances of fraudulent foreclosures that targeted minority landowners across the state. The pattern suggests a coordinated effort to concentrate valuable land in white hands regardless of legal ownership." This historical context transformed Clara's individual case into something larger, a challenge to decades of institutional theft that had shaped the economic landscape of the entire region. The implications were staggering, suggesting that successful prosecution of Clara's claim might open the door for other families to challenge their own losses. As the hearing date approached, Silas found himself reflecting on the transformations that had occurred in his own life since that rainy day at Melody's funeral. The lonely widower who had lived in careful isolation from his community's complexities had been replaced by a man willing to fight publicly for justice and family bonds that transcended conventional boundaries. Clara had changed too, growing not just physically, but in confidence and sense of purpose. The frightened child clutching her doll in the rain had evolved into a young woman who spoke with authority about her rights and her future. She had claimed her inheritance not just of land and money, but of pride and determination that no legal system could steal. The evening before the hearing, they sat together on the ranch porch as they had on so many other nights, watching the sun set behind mountains that had witnessed generations of struggles over land and belonging. Clara held her wooden horse while reading from her family's Bible, connecting the present moment to the long chain of ancestors who had faced their own battles with courage and dignity. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Silas asked. "Yes," Clara admitted, "but I'm not afraid. Mama always said that being afraid was different from being nervous. Nervous means you care about the outcome. Afraid means you think you can't handle whatever happens, and you think you can handle it." Clara looked at him with eyes that held depths of wisdom far beyond her years. "I think I can handle anything, as long as I don't have to handle it alone." The simple statement carried the weight of everything they had built together. Not just the legal case, but the family bonds that had grown from mutual need into something approaching love. Whatever tomorrow's hearing brought, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, with dignity intact and determination unshaken. Inside the house, Clara's family Bible lay open on the kitchen table, its genealogical records bearing witness to generations who had refused to be defeated by injustice. The wooden horse sat beside it, representing the gifts that flow between people who choose to see each other as family despite what the world might think of their bond. The battle would be decided in a courtroom, with lawyers and judges applying legal principles to human complexities. But the war had already been won in quieter moments, in shared meals and evening conversations, in nightmares comforted and skills taught, in the gradual recognition that families are built not by blood alone, but by the daily choice to stand together against whatever forces would tear them apart. Clara Washington had found her inheritance at last, and it was larger and more valuable than any land deed could convey. She had found herself, and in doing so, she had found the strength to fight for everything that mattered most. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge had never seen a crowd like the one that gathered on the morning of Clara's hearing. Judge Harold Martinez, traveling from the county seat for this special session, entered to find every seat occupied and people standing along the walls. Word had spread beyond the town's borders, drawing observers from across the county who came to witness a legal battle that represented larger questions about family, inheritance, and justice. Clara sat between Silas and James Whitfield at the plaintiff's table, wearing the blue dress that Mrs. Morrison had made specifically for this occasion. Her hair was braided with ribbon, and she carried herself with the composed dignity that had become her hallmark. In her hands, she held a small leather portfolio containing the original family photographs that had been preserved in her mother's Bible. Images of Marcus Washington in his military uniform, of Clara's grandparents standing proudly beside their first automobile, of family gatherings that spoke of prosperity and community that had been stolen along with their... Judge Martinez was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and the careful demeanor of someone who had learned to weigh evidence without being swayed by emotion or public pressure. He surveyed the packed courtroom with eyes that missed nothing, understanding that this case would be remembered long after other proceedings were forgotten. "This hearing will determine two related but separate matters," Martinez announced. "First, the question of custody and guardianship of Clara Washington. Second, the validity of her claim to land currently held by other parties. I will hear testimony on both issues, but I remind everyone present that this is a legal proceeding, not a public forum for community grievances." Vernon Hastings testified first, his lawyer presenting him as a concerned stepfather who had made a temporary decision under emotional duress, but was now prepared to provide appropriate care. Vernon spoke of steady employment in Kansas City, of housing arrangements suitable for a growing child, and of the importance of Clara being raised within her own racial community. "I made a mistake that day at the cemetery," Vernon said, his voice carrying practiced remorse. "Grief makes people do things they wouldn't normally consider. But I've had time to think, and I know Clara belongs with family who understand her background and can prepare her for the realities she'll face as a colored girl in this world." The testimony was well rehearsed but hollow, lacking the conviction that comes from genuine emotion. Vernon's eyes rarely met Clara's during his statement, and his references to family connection rang false to anyone who had witnessed his casual abandonment of her at the graveside. When Clara's grandmother took the stand, her testimony proved more compelling. Despite her advanced age, she spoke with clarity about family obligations and cultural identity. arguing that Clara belonged with people who shared her heritage and understood the particular challenges facing black children in America. "That child has roots in our family that go back generations," she said, her voice carrying the weight of lived experience. "She needs to know where she comes from, who her people are. A white man, no matter how well-meaning, can't give her that connection to her ancestors." But when James Whitfield presented the family photographs during cross-examination, something shifted in the courtroom atmosphere. The images told a story that contradicted Vernon's portrayal of a family in need of outside assistance. Marcus Washington appeared as a prosperous businessman, his descendants as educators and entrepreneurs who had built successful lives through their own efforts. "These photographs show your family at the height of their prosperity," Whitfield observed, "before their land was stolen through fraudulent foreclosure. Does Clara not have the right to know this history, to fight for the inheritance that was taken from her great-grandfather?" The grandmother's composure faltered slightly as she examined the images. "That was a long time ago. The land is gone. Dreaming about what might have been only brings heartache." When Clara took the stand, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. She had prepared for this moment through weeks of practice with Whitfield, but no amount of preparation could completely ease the pressure of having her entire future decided by her performance in the next few minutes. "Clara," Whitfield began gently, "can you tell the court about your life with Mr. Granger over the past months?" Clara's voice was clear and strong as she described her daily routine, her education, the skills she had learned, and the sense of belonging she had found. She spoke of evening conversations and morning chores, of being treated as a full member of the family rather than as a burden to be managed. "Mr. Granger has never tried to make me forget where I came from," she said, looking directly at the judge. "He's helped me learn about my family's history, including the land that was stolen from my great-grandfather. He's taught me that I can be proud of my heritage while still choosing my own future." When Vernon's lawyer questioned her about racial identity and cultural connection, Clara's response revealed the depth of her understanding about the complexities of her situation. "I know I'm a colored girl living in a white man's house," she said simply, "but I also know that Mr. Granger sees me as his daughter, not as someone different from him. He's taught me to judge people by their actions, not their skin color. Isn't that what we're supposed to learn?" The question hung in the air, challenging everyone present to consider their own assumptions about race and family. Even Vernon's lawyer seemed momentarily at a loss for a response that wouldn't make his client's motivations appear petty by comparison. Silas's testimony proved to be the emotional centerpiece of the hearing. When asked about his commitment to Clara's future, his response was unequivocal. "Your Honor, I didn't plan to become a father at 60, but sometimes life gives you gifts you didn't know you needed. Clara has brought purpose back into my world, and I'd like to think I've given her security and love in return. I'm prepared to adopt her legally if the court will permit it, and to help her fight for the inheritance that belongs to her by right. And if the land claims prove unsuccessful, if the legal battles become lengthy and expensive, then we'll face whatever comes together as families do. Clara is my daughter in every way that matters. That won't change regardless of what happens with property disputes or community opinions." The sincerity in Silas's voice was unmistakable, and its impact on the courtroom was immediate. Several spectators wiped away tears, and even Judge Martinez seemed affected by the quiet passion of the declaration. But the most dramatic moment came when Herman Morrison rose from the spectator section, asking permission to address the court. Despite objections from Vernon's lawyer, Martinez allowed the testimony, recognizing Morrison's standing as a long-time community member and business owner. "Your Honor," Morrison said, his weathered hands gripping his hat, "I've watched this man and this child build a family based on respect and genuine caring. More than that, I have documents that prove Vernon Hastings knew about Clara's potential inheritance before he filed for custody. His interest in that child has nothing to do with family, feeling and everything to do with mineral rights and land values." The revelation sent shocked murmurs through the courtroom and visibly shook Vernon's composure. For the first time since the hearing began, his carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing the calculating opportunist beneath the grieving stepfather persona. As the morning's testimony concluded, Judge Martinez announced a brief recess before hearing closing arguments. But the momentum had clearly shifted in Clara's favor, carried by the power of truth and the courage of a community finally willing to confront its own history of injustice. Judge Martinez returned to the courtroom after a recess that felt like hours, but lasted only 30 minutes. His expression revealed nothing as he took his seat and arranged the papers before him with deliberate care. The packed courtroom had grown even more crowded during the break, with people pressed against the walls and spilling into the hallway, all waiting to hear a decision that would resonate far beyond Clara's individual circumstances. "I have considered all testimony and evidence presented today," Martinez began, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "This case involves complex issues of custody, family rights, historical injustice, and property law. But at its center is a simple question. What arrangement best serves the interests of Clara Washington, a 10-year-old child who has already faced more upheaval and loss than most adults experience in a lifetime?" Clara sat perfectly still between Silas and Whitfield, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the judge. The wooden horse that Silas had carved for her was tucked in her dress pocket, a tangible reminder of the love and security she had found in the most unlikely circumstances. "Regarding the custody dispute," Martinez continued, "I find that Vernon Hastings' claim lacks both legal merit and genuine concern for the child's welfare. Mr. Hastings voluntarily relinquished any parental responsibilities at the time of Mrs. Washington's funeral, abandoning Clara without regard for her emotional needs or physical safety. His subsequent interest in reclaiming custody appears to be motivated primarily by the discovery of Clara's potential inheritance claims, not by paternal affection or family duty." Vernon's face darkened with anger, but his lawyer's restraining hand prevented him from speaking. The judge's words had stripped away any pretense that his motivations were noble, exposing the calculated opportunism that had driven his legal challenge. "Furthermore," Martinez said, "the evidence shows that Clara has thrived under Mr. Granger's care. She has demonstrated academic achievement, emotional stability, and personal growth that speaks to the quality of guidance she has received. Mr. Granger has provided not just shelter and sustenance, but genuine parental love and support." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom, but Martinez raised his hand for continued silence. "However, the matter of racial and cultural identity raised by Clara's grandmother deserves serious consideration. This court acknowledges that a white guardian cannot provide the same cultural connections and understanding of racial realities that Clara might receive within the black community. This is not a failure of character on Mr. Granger's part, but a practical limitation that must be weighed against other factors." Clara felt her heart sink, fearing that despite everything, the judge would still separate her from the only family she truly wanted. But Martinez was not finished. "That said, I find that Clara Washington has demonstrated remarkable maturity and self-awareness in her testimony today. She understands her racial identity and cultural heritage, while also embracing the family bonds she has formed through choice rather than blood. The court cannot ignore her clearly expressed wishes, especially when they are supported by evidence of genuine love and effective parenting." Martinez paused to review his notes, the silence in the courtroom so complete that the scratch of his pen was audible in the back rows. "Therefore, this court grants permanent guardianship of Clara Washington to Silas Granger, with the understanding that Mr. Granger will continue to support Clara's connection to her cultural heritage and family history. The court further orders that Clara's grandmother be granted reasonable visitation rights, recognizing the value of maintaining family connections while respecting Clara's primary placement. The courtroom erupted in applause and excited conversation before Martinez's gavel restored order. Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but they were tears of relief and joy rather than fear. Silas reached over to squeeze her hand. His own eyes bright with emotion, he made no attempt to hide, but Martinez was not finished. Regarding the property claims raised by Miss Washington's legal representatives, this court finds sufficient evidence to warrant a full investigation into the 1924 foreclosure of Marcus Washington's homestead. The documents presented suggest serious procedural violations that may have invalidated the original tax sale. He turned his attention to Herman Morrison, who sat in the front row with his own family papers spread across his lap. Mr. Morrison's testimony and documentary evidence regarding his father's involvement in the fraudulent foreclosure will be forwarded to the State Attorney General's office for potential criminal investigation. The court commends Mr. Morrison for his courage in bringing forward evidence that implicates his own family in historical wrongdoing. Morrison nodded gravely, understanding that his decision to support justice might cost him both socially and financially, but knowing it was the right choice, regardless of personal consequences. This court orders the immediate establishment of a trust fund for Clara Washington, to be administered by Mr. Granger until she reaches majority age. The fund will receive any proceeds from successful prosecution of her inheritance claims, ensuring that any recovered assets are preserved for her future benefit. The legal language was formal and precise, but its meaning was clear. Clara had won not just the right to remain with Silas, but official recognition of her claim to the inheritance that had been stolen from her family. The wooden horse in her pocket seemed to warm against her leg, as if sharing her triumph. As the hearing concluded and people began to file out of the courtroom, Clara found herself surrounded by well-wishers from the community. Mrs. Morrison hugged her warmly, promising to continue providing books for her education. Dr. Pritchard shook her hand with the respect due to an equal, recognizing in Clara a fellow scholar and fighter for justice. Even some of the ranchers whose properties might be affected by her inheritance claims approached to offer their support, understanding that Clara's victory represented something larger than individual gain. It represented the possibility that historical wrongs could be acknowledged and, to some extent, corrected. Vernon and Clara's grandmother left the courthouse together, their defeat complete but perhaps not entirely unwelcome. The grandmother had seen during the hearing that Clara was genuinely happy and well cared for, even if the arrangement challenged her assumptions about how families should be structured. Vernon's exposure as a fortune hunter had eliminated any possibility that his motives would be seen as noble, leaving him with no choice but to retreat from a battle he had never deserved to fight. That evening, as they drove home to the ranch in the gathering dusk, Clara held the official custody documents that made their family legal as well as emotional. The papers were formal and bureaucratic, but they represented something profound: society's recognition that love and commitment mattered more than convention or appearance. "Are you happy?" Silas asked as they turned into their driveway, the house lights welcoming them home from the day's battles. "I'm complete," Clara replied, the word carrying depths of meaning that surprised them both. "For the first time since Mama died, I feel like I belong exactly where I am." The judge's ruling lay between them on the wagon seat, official recognition of bonds that had been forged not in courtrooms, but in kitchen conversations and evening stories, in shared work and mutual respect. It was just paper, signed and sealed, but it represented the triumph of chosen family over biological accident, of justice over prejudice, of love over fear. Clara Washington had found her inheritance at last, and it was larger than any land grant could measure. 3 years after the courthouse victory, the Granger Ranch had become something neither Silas nor Clara could have imagined during those first tentative days when grief and uncertainty had brought them together. The morning sun still painted the same hills and valleys in gold and amber. But everything else had been transformed by the presence of family, where once there had been only solitude. Clara, now 13 and tall for her age, moved through her morning chores with the efficient grace of someone who had found her place in the world. Her hands, once small and uncertain, now handled ranch work with the same skill her mother had brought to needlework. But these were hands that also turned pages in advanced mathematics textbooks and wrote essays that impressed teachers who had initially doubted her abilities. The legal battles over her inheritance had concluded the previous year with a settlement that acknowledged historical wrongs while providing practical solutions for the present. Clara had recovered portions of her great-grandfather's original land, along with mineral rights that ensured her financial security for life. But more importantly, the case had established legal precedents that helped other families challenge similar fraudulent foreclosures, creating a legacy of justice that extended far beyond her individual circumstances. The money had allowed Clara to establish a scholarship fund for black students pursuing higher education, honoring her family's tradition of valuing learning above material possessions. She had insisted on naming the fund for her mother, ensuring that Melody Washington's legacy would help other children achieve dreams that circumstances might otherwise make impossible. But the real transformation had occurred not in courtrooms or bank accounts, but in the quiet moments that defined family life. Clara's nightmares had gradually faded, replaced by dreams of college and career plans that seemed entirely achievable. Her laughter filled the house that had once echoed with the silence of grief, and her questions about everything from cattle breeding to calculus kept Silas mentally agile in ways he hadn't expected at his age. Silas himself had changed in ways that went deeper than the grey, threading through his hair or the lines that mapped a face more often creased with smiles than solitude. The careful reserve that had protected him through years of widowerhood had been replaced by the easy confidence of a man who knew his purpose. Clara had given him not just someone to care for, but someone who challenged him to be better than he had thought possible. The county extension agent wants to know if you'll speak at their winter meeting about sustainable grazing practices, Clara said over breakfast, consulting the correspondence that she now handled for the ranch. Her organizational skills had evolved into a sophisticated understanding of agricultural business that impressed even veteran ranchers who had initially questioned her presence in their community. "What do you think?" Silas asked, a response that had become automatic whenever Clara presented him with opportunities that required public speaking. Her judgment about such matters had proven consistently sound. "I think you should do it. Your rotation system has increased our grass yield by 30% over 3 years, and other ranchers deserve to know how. Besides, it's good for people to see us succeeding together." The casual reference to us carried weight that neither of them needed to acknowledge explicitly. Clara had never wavered in her identification with the ranch and the partnership they had built. She spoke of future plans that included college and perhaps law school, but always with the understanding that this land would remain her anchor. And Silas would always be her father in every way that mattered. The community's acceptance had been gradual but genuine. What had begun as curiosity and controversy had evolved into respect for a family that had proven its worth through competence and character. Clara's academic achievements had silenced those who had predicted failure, while her graceful handling of her inheritance had demonstrated maturity that impressed even former critics. At the general store, conversations now included Clara as naturally as they included any other young person in the community. Her opinions about local issues were sought and valued, and her plans for the future were discussed with the same interest that any promising student might expect. The color of her skin had become merely one characteristic among many, rather than the defining feature that determined her place in society. On this particular morning, as they finished breakfast and prepared for their respective responsibilities, Clara made an announcement that had been building for weeks. "I've been thinking about the family portrait Mrs. Henderson offered to take," she said, referring to the photographer's wife, who had recently acquired a professional camera and was building a business documenting local families and events. "What about it?" "I think we should do it. We've never had a proper family picture, and I'd like to have one for posterity. Something that shows we chose to be together, not just that we happened to end up in the same place." The suggestion touched something deep in Silas's heart. They had dozens of informal photographs now. Clara with her prize-winning calf at the county fair, Silas teaching her to drive the tractor, both of them covered in mud after a particularly difficult calving season. But they had never commissioned a formal portrait, the kind of image that proclaimed to the world, "This is our family, and we are proud of what we've built together." "I'd like that very much," he said simply. The portrait session took place on a warm afternoon in late summer, with Clara wearing a dress she had sewn herself using skills inherited from her mother, and Silas in his best suit, the one he wore to church and important occasions. They posed on the porch of the house that had become their shared sanctuary, with the mountains visible in the background and the late-day light casting everything in the golden warmth that Montana summers were famous for. Mrs. Henderson worked with professional efficiency, but also with evident pleasure in documenting a family that represented something remarkable in their small community. Clara's wooden horse sat on the porch railing beside them, small but visible, a reminder of the gifts that had marked the beginning of their bond. "Look at each other," Mrs. Henderson instructed for the final shot. "Not at the camera, at each other." The resulting photograph captured something that formal poses could not, the genuine affection and mutual respect that had grown from desperate circumstances into unshakable love. Clara's eyes held the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world, while Silas's expression showed the contentment of a man who had discovered that family could arrive at any age, in any form, when the heart was open to receive it. That evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of gold and purple, Silas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 years ago, he had been a lonely widower going through the motions of living. Today, he was a father whose daughter was planning to study law so she could help other people fight for justice the way she had fought for her own. Inheritance. Do you ever wonder how different things would have been if I hadn't been at the cemetery that day?" he asked. Clara considered the question with the thoughtfulness she brought to everything important. "I think you would have been there," she said finally. "Maybe not that exact day, but someday. I think some people are meant to find each other, and they usually do, one way or another." The wisdom in her words reminded Silas why their bond had survived every challenge it had faced. Clara possessed an understanding of human nature and moral obligation that went far beyond her years, combined with the practical intelligence needed to build the kind of life she deserved. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Silas thought about the moment that had changed everything, kneeling in the rain beside a grieving child who had needed rescue and discovering that he needed saving just as much as she did. Some moments do change everything, he realized. The trick is recognizing them when they arrive and having the courage to act on what they offer. Clara Washington had given him more than family. She had given him purpose and joy, and the knowledge that love was not limited by age or race or convention. In return, he had given her security and guidance, and the foundation from which she could reach for any future she chose to claim. Their family portrait would hang in the living room, a formal recognition of bonds that needed no legal documents or social approval to make them real. But the true testament to their partnership was visible everywhere around them, in the thriving ranch, in Clara's confident plans for college and career, in the quiet satisfaction of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to become, who they were meant to be. Some stories begin with endings, and some families are built from the pieces of other families that have been broken by loss and time. But the best stories, like the best families, are marked not by how they begin, but by how they choose to continue. Growing stronger and more complete with each day, they choose to face together. The wooden horse sat on the porch railing, keeping watch over their shared evening and their shared future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but they would meet them as they had met everything else, together. With love as their foundation and hope as their compass, in the end, that was inheritance enough for any family, chosen or born.